So first of all, welcome to everybody that has joined. I'm Stephen Jacobs from Organic Farmers and Growers. First of all, what we'll do is I'll show you some slides. Can everybody see those? If I do that. So, and as I click through them, you will see that today's webinar, brought to you by the good people of the AHDB in association with Organic Farmers and Growers, NIAB and the Organic Research Centre, is called Seeds and Deeds. It's about collective plant breeding for reduced input farming. So the idea is that plant breeders and farmers will work together, and to help us understand and discuss this, we have a very good and eminent crew, starting with Dr. Ambrogio Costanzo from the Organic Research Centre. Ambro, can you tell us who you are and what you do, please?
Hello, I hope everyone can hear me, and welcome to the webinar. I would say nice to see you, but anyway, here we are. I'm leading the crops team at the Organic Research Centre since 2016, and what I'm mostly doing here is reporting some evidence from what we could see through weeds of what's going on organic farm in England. This is the live wheat program in which a number of farmers, including Mark Lee, which is one of the other panelists today, are testing varieties into their organic farms as part of their farming systems, and this led us to collect some evidence about how things are going on farms, and that's what I will show you later based on the results of the past 2 years when this program was called the Live Seed. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. And Emily Pope. Emily, you're Knowledge Transfer Manager at AHDB, is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct, Stephen. Thank you. And good morning, everybody, as well. As Amber said, it's a shame that we can't all be together, but hopefully we'll be able to have a good discussion, and you can ask questions using the chat function on the webinar as well. So hopefully we'll get your thoughts and ideas as well. As for myself, so I joined AHDB in 2015, and since then I've been working across our strategic and monitor farm programme, working together with farmers to design on-farm trials, looking at a range of different challenges and opportunities, connecting with our research projects and programmes, looking obviously the cost benefit of different management approaches, including currently at the moment we've got trials looking at managed low input, different varieties on the recommended list, looking at how farmers can tailor their management decisions and systems to their local conditions.
Excellent, thank you very much. And also joining us, Mark Lee. Mark, you're farming in Shropshire, is that right?
That's right, thank you, Stephen. Good morning. We are a 450 acre mixed organic farm in Shropshire, so sort of extremist low input. We're a very mixed farm, arable and cattle and sheep, deliberately mixed. Also deliberately diverse in every way we can, in the belief that that strengthens our system. Both the enterprises and the cropping are diverse. Weeds are our biggest issue, and that really is my main focus with what we're going to talk about today, because our weed control, although it's based around rotation and livestock and mechanical control and those things, crop suppression and variety choice are central also. So weeds are my obsession, and that's the way I will always go.
Thank you very much, Mark. And last but not least, Dr. Phil Howell from NIAB. Phil, what's your job title?
It's quite simple. It's plant breeder. So I've been at NIAB since 2006, and before then I was a wheat breeder at Syngenta for 10 years. So you all probably know of NIAB for its more traditional roles. So we have an important role on official seed testing and statutory work, like helping run the national list. running trials and seed certification. But what we also have is a large farmer membership, so we do a lot of knowledge transfer with the farmer membership, a lot of agronomy trials. We do contract trials for all sorts of organisations. And then in the last 10 years or so, which is where I come in, we've had a big effort on research on pre-breeding in particular, and that's what I'll be talking about. So trying to increase the genetic diversity of our crops and hopefully make them more resilient going forwards.
Great stuff, thank you. And we know who I am. So we're going to cover as much of this as we can. The three main aspects, obviously, that focus people's thoughts are fertility, weeds, and seeds. When you're reducing inputs, you could be looking at reducing or replacing any ammonium nitrate, and you would use compost, legumes, leys, manures, but also a diverse crop rotation. We can look at weeds in terms of cultivation techniques, but also timing and crop rotation again. And with seeds, it's which varieties are more competitive, better uptake of nutrient, and obviously disease resistance is key. And of course, there is a fourth aspect, a fourth dimension, as it were. We are up against the clock, both in terms of this webinar, but also because obviously one of the things we all know is that farmers carry a lot of risk, and that risk is largely dependent on the weather. So if I can ask Phil, would you start, please?
Yes, thank you, Stephen. So as I mentioned, the breeding work that we do, strictly speaking, it's what we call pre-breeding. So pre-breeding, it's all about broadening the genetic diversity for crop improvement. So reducing this narrow bottleneck of selection that's been used in the breeding of elite varieties. And because we're making much wider crosses than normal, we're bringing in this genetic diversity. Most of the crosses, from a commercial perspective, they don't work. So if I'd made the selections I make at NIAB when I'd been at Syngenta, I would have got the sack very quickly, because clearly they're not going to be barn filling varieties. So it's risky, and it's kind of a long-term aspect, so we shouldn't expect quick results from it. And that's because generally these wide crosses, they provide the parents and the grandparents of future varieties, rather than a quick fix to produce the varieties themselves. So we're looking one, maybe two cycles ahead, trying to look ahead all the time. And it's just about bolstering the genetic background that commercial breeders can then dip into. But having said that, it's a vital source of new weapons in the battle against pests, diseases, and even the challenges of climate change. So by having this broad base of genetic diversity, hopefully there are more tools in the box for growers in the future to be able to cope with shifts in disease, changes in pest pressure, the impact of drought, waterlogging, and so on. And so it's essential for providing the raw materials for future crop varieties. Can I have the next slide? Within some of our pre-breeding projects, thank you, we've developed thousands of diverse new types. And as I said, most of these will be rubbish, but hidden amongst them will be some gems, the needles in the haystack. Commercial breeders are very much part of this work. We work alongside them. Their input is extremely important, and they've already started to look from our material at what looks like the best. But of course, they're largely focused on yield. If they focus on yield, then there's a danger of the bottleneck effect happening again. By focusing on the yield, there's a risk of missing out on other traits, such as flavor, nutrition, resilience, and under harsh conditions. So we need to change our model of testing. We need to try and investigate these difficult areas too. Deliberately putting trials and making selection under stressful conditions, and not just looking at the yield in isolation, but taking it through to the final product. So for example, we have some trials this year where we're running them under reduced fertilizer inputs. We're looking at the yield, of course we are, but we're also going to take some of them through to look at the grain protein levels, and right the way through to baking to look at loaf performance, to try and see is there a particular type of variety or new diverse line that performs well under lower nitrogen inputs. Technically, it's harder to do trials in less than ideal conditions, but a big criticism that may be leveled from farmers at the recommended list, for example, is that the results are too perfect because you're throwing so many inputs at them, they don't translate to real farm situations. So hopefully the sort of work we're doing is allowing us to select varieties that might be better suited to more realistic conditions. And we believe we need to involve more partners in the way we select. So rather than just going through these with the commercial breeders and being steered too far by their selection goals, we need to bring in other partners. We need to bring in the growers and then the end users, people who make ingredients, the people who actually manufacture the food, and even the people who sell the food, the retailers. So the way we want to do this really is, well, we think we can make rapid improvement built on our sort of science research platform. So there are some smart phrases here that I'll try and explain a bit more. So speed breeding is a way of shoehorning multiple generations into a single calendar year. So it's been described as plant breeding, but leaving the lights switched on. You can, if all you need to do is to go from planting a seed to harvesting the next seed, planting the seed, harvesting the next seed. That's what you need to do to fix the variety, make it stable. You can get through those generations very quickly by having very long day lengths, reducing the amount of fertilizer in the compost, shuttling it through the greenhouse as quickly as possible. So you can make a lot of difference very quickly. Smart genetic selection is using some of the genetic markers, so understanding the genetics behind particular traits, identifying at an early stage what we think are the winners and the losers. So you can do a lot of the selection before you even go to the field. The field testing is to confirm your results, not just to make your selections, but of course field selection is still really important because that's where the crop's going to be grown. We've made a lot of use at NIAB recently of making complex crosses. So rather than just crossing elite parent A with elite parent B, in some cases we've brought together 16 different parents in a very complicated pedigree, and that allows us to bring in all sorts of different diversity. So we've made crosses using varieties dating back to the early 20th century. We've done work with land races, and in particular, we're interested in looking at bringing diversity in from the relatives of wheat. So some of the wild wheats and related grasses, we can explore that variation that's been left behind in the domestication of wheat as we know it. And what's crucial is that we don't forget about the fundamentals of classic field trialing and selection. So we need to, yes, we've got these fancy new techniques, but we need an old head as well. So we need to use the skills of field observation, knowing when to plant at the right time in the right conditions, and bring all that together and have a dialogue, talk to people, listen to their feedback. And we need to consider different models. So at the moment we're thinking about sort of consortia, variety improvement clubs, where we get input from growers and end users about the direction in which we want the material to be moving towards, what's important to them rather than what's important to us. And consider different end products. So the classic is to have a very inbred variety that's genetically completely homogeneous. That may not be the best product for all situations. So we need to consider different models. It may be the fact that what suits people more in the future is, rather than 30% of the UK acreage being a single variety, we have far more varieties, but they're used much more locally. We may have a local breeding and selection program supplying local mills, supplying local bakers. We need to consider these sorts of models. We're interested in the effect of mixed populations or blends of varieties rather than the classic monoculture. These may be more resilient, better able to cope with the different stresses of different seasons, and certainly there needs to be a lot more research into that. And intercropping is another interesting area. So rather than just saying we need to grow this cereal variety with this legume variety, not every variety on either side is equivalent. So there are probably certain combinations that are optimal, and they may not be optimal for every situation. We need to really tailor what suits each grower, what suits each region best. So there's a lot of research work to be done moving forwards on that. We've also seen in some of the trials, we've looked at reducing inputs in terms of fertility. By coincidence this year, one of our big trials is in a very high blackgrass situation. And because we have this range of diversity in the material that we're testing, we're actually able to, I hope, test for competitiveness against the blackgrass. So I think we're seeing differences which aren't just due to the weed pressure, they're due to the competitiveness of the varieties. So some of that will translate to final yield. And of course, unfortunately, some of that will translate to the seed bank that goes in to the farmer's next crop. But it'll be really interesting to test if it's leafy varieties or tall varieties or a combination of both, if it's high tillering, low tillering, what the best situation is for suppressing the blackgrass in those situations. So welcome any questions later on, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Phil. That's great. That's a very good introduction to it all. We've had a couple of questions already, if I can just quickly put these to you.
Okay, yeah.
Andrew Trump from Organic Arable has asked, where are the NIAB trials being hosted?
The reduced nitrogen trial I was talking about is just south of Cambridge this year. We're hoping if we can work it up into a project to have networks of those, but we run, as part of our NIAB membership for growers, we run a whole series of trials right across, certainly across England every year, and the membership are able to, they come up with some ideas every year about themes for trials. So there's all sorts about tweaking fungicides and whatever, but if members wish to have low input trials, then they can put that forward for the next year. And
funding for NIAB, how does that work? You're private now, aren't you? A private business.
We're a not-for-profit company, so we get some of our money for the statutory work. We get grants from DEFRA to do that, but we have to tender for those every 5 years. So that's for the national list work and for the seed certification and the seed testing. We run commercial trials for anyone who's willing to pay for them, and we apply for all sorts of grants. So from agricultural charities, from the research councils, from the EU, from AHDB, and often we have public-private partnerships. So we're in as an academic partner, and industry would be in as another partner. So we're hopefully we're very happy to work with anyone.
Great, thank you very much. I think there's more questions, but I think if we march on, Christian, can we start the polling? We've got 3 very simple questions to ask of our audience to see what you guys think. So the first poll says, what do you think are the biggest challenges you face as a producer? So Christian is leading the polling from the technical side, and I can see that people are responding. So far, weather is the uppermost in people's minds. We'll run that for another few seconds if we can. The numbers are still switching around a bit. Okay, so at the end of that one, weather is 86%, 87%, soil health at 13%, and carbon footprint is not uppermost on our minds. Now remember, these are just quick polls just to help us frame today's discussion. But Christian, can we run the next one as well, please? So that was one of the biggest challenges. What are the biggest opportunities for you? So is it domestic supply chain, export market? Are you interested in the opportunity with providing public goods? So the numbers are still flicking around. Domestic supply chain, very, very strong there. Export markets are featuring, but not so much. Another few seconds, I think, just let those numbers settle down. Great, okay, thank you. So in that one, we can see that our export markets, whilst important, and obviously we all know they can help balance off trade, actually, domestic supply chain is primary to our audience. And providing public goods is a strong second place. So we've got one more poll, do that in a bit. But if we can just move on, let me get back to my slides. Here we are. So, Mark, if you could unmute, please, and put your camera on and talk to us, perhaps, for a few minutes about Greenacres Farm.
Yes, well, I said that we're deliberately diverse farm, organic farm. The cropping is fairly diverse as well, but wheat is an important part of that. We have increasingly grown milling wheats. We're this year onto all milling wheats, with the intention of all our wheat being specialist milling sold direct to millers and bakers. This is something we've been moving towards over the last 2 or 3 years, partly because of the problem, the widespread problem amongst organic farmers that we struggle with modern wheat. We were growing very disillusioned with wheat growing 4 or 5 years ago, and I did contemplate dropping wheat altogether. It's not that modern wheats can't perform under organic conditions. They do sometimes do very well, but they are unreliable. Inconsistent results were the norm, and that's largely, in my case, largely because of weed control and variability in weed control of modern wheats, and that weed control, the lack of weed control, is a huge influence on our yields. So we found that frustrating, along with many other people, that these wheats were not suited to in our case, very low input situations, and that led me into the live seed and now live wheat work that Ambro's going to describe. We're now in our 3rd year of those trials, which is really farmer-run trials on a large scale. So we grow wheats either in strips or in blocks, but under exactly the same conditions. So we might have a number of varieties grown in a field, perhaps 8 or 10 varieties in a field, with exactly the same management, same soil, same everything, more or less across the board, and then we can get a direct comparison. The first slide that we can see there is probably the clearest image that I have to show this work. To the left of centre of that screen is YQ, which is obviously not a variety. Those that most people will know is the Organic Research Centre Wakelins population, which is a true wheat population developed by Martin Wolf. To the right of centre is a block, I think, there of 6 or 7 modern wheats all together. The height difference isn't very clear there, but the poppy difference is. we had about 10% of the poppy number in the YQ than we did in the modern wheats, with exactly the same weed control, mechanical weed control. So it highlighted immediately to me and inspired me to continue with this work, really, that there was the proof of what we'd been feeling all along, that modern wheats were unable to suppress weeds effectively. They have obviously not been developed with weed suppression in mind. YQ is a much more vigorous, much taller, but much leafier crop, which does suppress weeds very well. So that got me back into wheat in a way, the discovery of YQ, and inspired me to carry on with this. The reasons are not just height and vigor, as I said. There is another. Can I have the next slide, please? Our weed control is mechanical once we are in crop, rotational obviously out of it, and livestock and various other things. But once we've got a crop with weeds in it, we only have two things left really. That's mechanical and the suppression of the crop on the weeds. Mechanical weeding for us is largely around harrowing now, which is a very basic process. Obviously, very old-fashioned process, you might say, which is just, in simple terms, abusing the whole lot and hoping that the crop is stronger than the weeds. A bit more than hope. We try and time it correctly so that the crop, in this case, this is rye, I think, this year, has better, stronger rooting than the weeds at that point. So we're more likely to destroy weeds than we are crop. But clearly from the photograph there, it's a fairly brutal process. So we need our crops to be resilient to that. They need to be both vigorous and grow well, but also tolerant of that mechanical abuse that we give them, or burial. A lot of soil movement there, so plants are also buried. So weaker, less robust wheat varieties simply don't come back as well. We find, certainly in the case of older wheats, and very old wheats in particular, will respond better to this sort of mechanical abuse. They even seem to like it. Obviously, there's some nitrogen mineralized when we do this stuff as well. A wheat crop can actually look an awful lot better 3 weeks after you've harrowed it than it does before, which is hard to believe when you look at that photograph there. So it's a combination of features we're looking for in our wheats in terms of weed control: height, vigor, leaf growth and habit, but also that robustness, really, the strength to return after the physical abuse. Next slide, please. We can't just grow poppies, we grow all weeds very well on this farm. A number of our, in fact, in our probably our top weeds, charlock, like a lot of organic farmers, we've struggled with it, increasingly struggled with it. I think we're 20 years into organic and we're not winning with charlock. I think milder winters is a factor in that, but which is not helping us. But we're certainly not winning in the weeds that can release huge numbers of small seeds back into our seed bank. This is the live wheat block this year. Extreme left of that photo is tall wheats, Maris-Widgeon and YQ. Extreme right of that photo are back to tall wheats. There's a Malika cross holdfast from McDickin, and then YQ again to the right. The block through the centre are the modern wheats, obviously shorter and less able to compete with charlock. Again, it's not just a case that you can see more because they're shorter. There is genuinely smaller and fewer plants there. Smaller more than fewer, I think. The plants are still there, but they're suppressed by the vigorous growth of the taller wheats. Next slide, please. There is an advantage, and it has to be said that where I'm there weed surfing, that's just trimming the weed growth above the crop. Again, timing is critical with this. There's sometimes opportunities, not always, but sometimes opportunities where the weed, in this case charlock, is standing clear of the wheat canopy, and we're able to surf over the top and trim it off. That obviously works better with shorter weeds. So I surfed the whole lot again so that the treatments were consistent, but I was able to do a more complete job with the surfing in the shorter weeds. So not all disadvantages in being shorter and consistent in height, but I'd still sooner have the weeds not there in the first place. Next one, thank you. Same block of wheats yesterday. That's where we are this year, a much lower weed burden this year, obviously with drought here like everywhere else. The only positive of drought is that we have much lower weed vigor as well. The line just to the left of centre there, across the left of the image, left of that is that Maris widgeon to the left, and then a strip of YQ, and everything to the right is that we can see there with the sprinkling of poppers in it is modern alabaster. KWS alabaster is the one ahead of us, which, to be fair to it, was a mile behind the Maris widgeon and YQ through the winter. Vastly lower ground cover in our March ground cover measurements. Looked a long way behind, looked poor in fact through the winter, but it's coming through now, and it will be no surprise, well, it will be a surprise as far as the yields are, but no surprise if the alabaster doesn't do well after all the struggle that it's had. Thinking back to the first image with those awful poppies in the short wheats, the crispin, which was right next to the tall wheats, was our top yielder. So certainly not suggesting that the modern wheats can't yield on organic systems, but it's that reliability that's a problem and a frustration, particularly when it comes to return of weed seeds into a ground, that are a problem throughout the rotation. Last photo, thank you. This is completely different. Weeds being an obsession, we are motivated to do anything we can to try and control them. And this is just a picture of about 3 or 4 weeks ago. It's a bit out of date now. We are part of the Living Mulch Innovative Farmers Field Lab. And this is buckwheat, which we are growing experimentally for milling, with a micro-leafed white clover, wild white clover understory established at the same time, which will go on to be a living mulch for, in this case, winter oats, but it will work with winter wheat as well, hopefully, to be direct drilled into that clover living mulch this autumn. So it's really just an example of attempting to reduce our cultivations for all the reasons we know, but in our case, reduce the cultivations to reduce the germination of weed seeds and that recycling of seeds through the soil bank. So it's really just an example of how our weed control is constant throughout our whole system, or our attempts at weed control are, but variety choice and sort of variety structure is an important part of it. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark. It's very good, very interesting. So we've had a question, but before I get to that, I just wanted to, so your cropping system is a crop rotation. How soon will those weeds come back into that field? What happens in between, etc.?
We tend to grow only one wheat crop per rotation. That may change if the Living Mulch project succeeds. I'm very aware that it may well not. That's a heck of a challenge that we're all taking on there. But wheat is a hungry crop that we in the past have found on medium or light land. Certainly, we can only grow once in a 5-year rotation. On heavier land, we might push our luck with 2 wheats within a rotation, but not ever consecutively.
And with oats or beans or other crops?
Oats are our biggest crop on this farm. We do grow those twice in a rotation commonly. Again, not in subsequent cropping, but we don't have disease problems if we grow oats 2 years out of 5. And oats are, for all the reasons that I've just described, with modern wheat being a bad crop in terms of weed suppression, oats, of course, are great. Organic farmers have long loved oats in terms of growing them. They are strong and vigorous and will suppress weeds well. So oats are the foundation of our rotation, really.
Are they just for feed?
No, the oats are all sold through organic arable to whites in Northern Ireland. So we really try and grow everything for the highest market we can. As I said, with the wheats, all the wheats this year are grown with the aim of direct sale to millers and bakers. All the oats are grown for milling, going over to whites. Okay,
so Jack, now I'm going to mispronounce your surname. I do apologise in advance, but I've got to give it a go. Jack Senyuri has asked, how does the YQ wheat compete with wild oats?
Well, wild oats are, I mean, a challenge for anything to compete with, I think. We don't have many on this farm, and don't ask me why. I don't know why that hasn't become a problem, but it hasn't. They will suppress, and YQ is a tremendous wheat for suppression. It's big, it's strong, it's robust, and it winters really well. It's away quickly in the autumn, so it has all the features that I love, and weed suppression is the result of those features. So I would say it suppresses wild oats, but only in the sense of better competition, the same as almost across the board.
So talking competition leads us on to yield. Andrew Trump's made a good point there, good question. What's the range of yield between the old and the news, between the heritage and modern wheats?
A big range. I mean, we would say, I mean, I talked there about YQ. We would not expect in any one year YQ to top our yields. It was never. Martin Wolf would have said endlessly that that's not the idea. The idea is resilience and reliability, which I would absolutely agree with. Our top within our live seeds trials in the past are, this is in blocks across a field. So my average field yields are certainly not at this level, but we would be around about 5.5 tons per hectare of the best modern wheats, maybe with YQ perhaps coming in third, maybe in a block of 8 or 10 wheats. Heritage types, true heritage types, YQ would perhaps come in at somewhere like 4.6 tons to the hectare. This is 1 year's results I'm thinking of when I give these figures. And true heritage wheats, sort of 100-year-old plus wheats, would be down about 3 tons to the hectare.
And just quickly, because we need to move on, but when we looked at this a couple of years ago with you, there was a big problem with admix, and that actually the yield that you were getting on the weighbridge wasn't surviving grain cleaning. How does that compare with the old and the heritage and modern wheats? Is that still an issue?
Yeah, it's a big issue. It's a big factor. I say we attempt to sell all our wheat direct to millers or bakers, in fact. So we sell from our farm. We sell our wheats ready to mill. So that means a lot of cleaning, and we have problems, real problems with modern wheats from that point of view. It's obviously a disadvantage in terms of yield suppression and seed return in the field, but there's also the big problem of admix in the wheat in store, that we will lose up to 10% of wheat in our efforts to clean out admix from the dirty wheats, and the dirty wheats are the short-strawed, uncompetitive ones.
That's interesting. Thank you very much, Mark. We'll bring you back into the discussion in a little while. We'll go on to Ambro now, if that's okay, and then we'll have a last polling question, and then we'll have a general chat. So, Dr. Costanzo, could you please elucidate further on live wheat?
Yes, thank you. So my work, and especially the work with the live wheat and the live seed in the past 2 years, really sits in between Phil Howell's work and Mark's work. What I mean is that whilst we try to understand together with Mark and the other farmers what are the best strategies, the best varieties to improve farm performance, we also hope to help breeding and pre-breeding to better identify the need for the future. As Phil said, they need to look ahead much more than normal breeding. And so we hope also that this evidence that I am going to show you can sort of be useful. Take all data with a reasonable pinch of salt, because these are just data from 2 years and 2 very different years. The key thing here is to build a data set. So the more years we have, the more solid the data are going to be. The first, Stephen was in fact talking about fertility, weeds, and seeds. So the first thing I wanted to share is about the fertility and what the wheat on the farms told us about fertility. If we can see the graph in the bigger, the next slide perhaps. Okay, so here you have the grain yield on the horizontal and the grain protein of the wheats on the vertical, and the dots are the different farms The black dots are the first year, 2 years ago, the year with a very dry summer, and the white dots are the second year, so last year, as you know, very different. And putting all this data together, the first impression is that I might have been naive, but I was surprised because I was thinking to see that in the highest yielding farms, I was expecting to see low protein due to a dilution effect. On the contrary, we see that there is a very neat and very strong relationship between yield and protein. Basically, this tells us that for each additional tons per hectare, if we look across farms, we have 0.5% more protein. What this tells us is that probably both yield and protein are constrained by fertility and especially by nitrogen in organic farms, which means that when nitrogen is more readily available due to rotation or other aspects, this improves both the yield and the protein and vice versa. This can have interesting impacts also about variety choice. For example, very high yielding farm may think of sacrificing a little bit of yield to try and get more protein for a milling wheat. And on the other side, farms that are struggling a little bit with yield may try to not try with a milling wheat, but to sensibly improve their yields going towards feed, or at least that's what some of the farmers who have participated did. Another very important aspect here is that we had two very different years, as you might remember, 2018 and 2019. And as you would expect, some farmers, you have the one with the red circle, WR01, had very different performance in both yield and protein between the first and the second year, while some other farms, as you see TF01, no mystery, this is Mark Lee, have been very, very consistent. So this is, there are no definitive replies to this question, but of course, looking at this evidence, we start to inquire to ask what into the cropping systems can make a farm so consistent, and what potentially can other farms do. For Mark Lee, there is potentially the idea of rotation and of the use of compost from many, many years that might help balancing out the odds and the alias of the climate, whereas other farms may just have some more sensitive soil to spring droughts, etc. If we go to the next slide, the second question was about the weeds. So consider that we, with live wheat, we do not create the experiment into an experimental station or into a farm. We just use, in inverted commas, of course, the real farm as part of a collective experiment. So we had 11 farms in these 2 years. 6 of those farms drill wheat with what we call the narrow rows, like very much like Mark Lee, so 12 to 15 centimeters, and manage weeds mechanically with the springtime harrowing, as Mark has shown earlier. The other 5 are actually using a sowing scheme that we call the wide rows, which means they drill at sort of 25 centimeters wide rows, and they manage wheat mechanically with an inter-row hoeing. What we saw from interviewing is that most of those farmers have switched from the narrow rows to the wide rows in an attempt to better control weeds. So how did the two systems compare? In the graph to the left, you see the weed abundance. This is the cover of weeds that we measured in June in the past 2 years. And in fact, in the wide rows farms, those who actually do the power hoeing, the abundance of weeds is significantly lower than in the narrow rows farms. So these more intensive systems actually do help in reducing the weed burden. There is a little caveat, though. If you see the graph on the right, this is perhaps a little bit more counterintuitive. The smaller weed abundance that you have in the wide rows farms, the farms with the inter-row hoeing, has significantly higher dominance, which means that there is a higher risk that one individual weed species, in many cases this is wild oats, by the way, can become the dominant weed, which if in a single season may not be a massive problem, it can be a problem of seed return, because we know more and more from the scientific literature that the more diverse a weed community is, the less damaging it is for yield. So yes, weed needs to be controlled, but as I generally say, an organic farmer also cultivates the crop as well as cultivating the weeds and trying to shape the weed community towards something that is as diverse as possible. So there is no good system or bad system. It all depends on how the farms develop, and it all depends on us to monitor and see. For example, surfing is very relevant on the white rose farms to avoid seed returns, and so can keep under control this effect that we call dominance. Can we go to the first slide, please? So, right, of course, it is live wheat and live seed started as a variety trials, so I think everyone would be expecting how did varieties perform. In the graph to the left, you see the varieties in terms of yield on the horizontal axis and protein on the vertical. Whilst when we saw the farm averages, we saw an increasing line. Here, when we see varieties, we do see the expected yield and protein trade-off. So this yield protein trade-off from our observation really seems to be a genetic phenomenon and not a management phenomenon. So the more yield a variety can provide, the less protein we can expect from it. And we did observe three aspects here. So the first one is that we have two quite clear clusters of varieties, one of high yielding varieties, and we have evolution, C.I.C, Crispin, and Revelation. And you see three of them are group 4 varieties or feed varieties. The other one, C.I.C, is a group 2 variety. And a group of high protein varieties, which of course has less yield. And has Montana, and Zayat, milling, commercial milling wheat. We have Mariswegian, the historic Mariswegian variety, and the YQ composite cross population, the ORC Wakeness population. Interestingly, Mariswegian and YQ seem to behave like what Phil would call the yield protein deviation, which means that they have higher protein. They seem to have higher protein than what their yield would lead you to expect. Interestingly, and this leads us to the graph to the right, which shows by variety the amount of weeds that we detected during flowering. Mariswegian and the YQ population are also the ones who have lower weed burden. So perhaps due to their taller height, they're having heritage or old germplasm in it, or perhaps to better scavenging nutrients. All of these can be linked also to a better competition towards weeds. We don't know, it's a sort of chicken and egg to understand what's generated what, but these are the two who seems to be yield protein deviations, and also the two that seems to have less weeds in organic farms. Of course, if we go to the last slide, the challenge here is not to look at these aspects separately, but as you might expect, all these three aspects are very interconnected. And here I just wanted to show a highlight of how we try, as long as we accumulate more data and more evidence with Mark and the other farmers, to collate all these dynamics into a systems approach. For example, here you see two graphs. On the horizontal axis, in both graphs, you have the ground cover of wheat, which Mark has mentioned. And on the vertical, you have grain yield on the left and grain protein on the right. And observing all the observation from the different farms, the different varieties, and the 2 years, whilst we know that predicting what a field of wheat will provide in terms of yield or protein before harvest is quite a recurrent question in farming and in the industry. We tried just as a game to see whether we can find something that can help us doing that. And we see that across all the variables that we measured, the ground cover that we can measure visually during flowering is indeed the strongest predictor of both yield and protein. But this relationship interacts with the sowing scheme. So the line that actually links ground cover to yield as well as to protein is steeper into the wide rows farm, which are shown by the dotted line, the dashed line, and is a little bit flatter in the narrow rows farms. So these dynamics depend on the farming system and on the choices the farmers have done. And this is for me, and I hope that this evidence can start helping stimulating some questions, and as well that as long as we build more data, we can have some good suggestion for both farming and the breeding. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambro. That's really good. So questions on yield, but rather than going into those again, can I ask, have you calibrated equipment? So you're talking about wide and narrow row, timing as well, timing of cultivation, are those factors that you can measure?
We collect all the field logs of the farmers that they generously provide us and respond to all our questions, also when we forget that we have already asked the same questions, but we don't definitely we don't tell farmers what to do. It's quite the opposite. So farmers manage those varieties, the strips. This is their field. They know how to manage. And what we say is do what you think is right, as long as you let us know. So of course, all these aspects, we know when the hoeing is done, when the springtime harrowing is done, what the rotation is, when the sowing date is. All these variables, as much data we have, as best we can merge them all together. And this year with live wheat, we are improving the way we are collecting information, thanks also to organic arable team who are going to help farmers at harvest and try also to measure the admix effect that Mark was mentioning earlier, that we may have slightly missed in the past years. So trying and improving as we go.
And that regional variation. So first of all, how many farmers are involved in live wheat at the moment?
At the moment, we have 15, 16, of which 8 are growing strips of winter wheat, because of course the others didn't manage to drill because of the autumn that we all went through. And we are starting then to make use of the, let's say, free time to monitor a bit of spring wheat. And they are all across West Midlands, East Midlands, and East Anglia mostly.
Great. Okay. Thank you very much. So I think if everybody can come in and switch the cameras on, we can have this conversation for another few minutes. And in fact, just before that, do all come in anyway. Christian, can we run that last poll, please? So in this one, everybody, we want to ask you, where do you see British agriculture in the next 5 to 10 years? I know it's not a big question, is it? It is a bit of a silly question because obviously it depends. But are you optimistic? How optimistic? So people are fairly split, as one could expect. I'm looking at the numbers, they're still moving around. There's some pessimism rearing its head. And maybe one could say realistic is a better option. Right, I'd say that's fairly conclusive. Thank you. So the results are that people generally feel that agriculture in the UK will increase, but there's a very strong thread there that people are cautious. I suppose many people, strangely, actually, I think, say farmers are risk averse, which is odd, because it's one of the riskiest occupations you could possibly be in. So well done. Thank you all very much for that last poll. So helping us now frame the discussion, one of the things that came up earlier on in the questions was about how we move things forward. Who's going to pay for it all? So, Emily, what are you seeing from the farmers that you work with in terms of how they're going to move, perhaps from what they're doing now to something else, whatever it is? How does that get facilitated? Who pays to help with knowledge or whatever?
Yeah, so from my perspective, obviously working through, there's a variety of knowledge exchange programs that farmers are involved with. Obviously through AHDB, we've got our Farm Excellence platform, which is our Monte Farms and Strategic Farms. So that in itself is funded by levy payers. So, you know, we're obviously always encouraging people to get involved in those programs because they're paying for them ultimately. And I know Mark's already mentioned innovative farmers as well. So that's obviously something that we're involved with. I think in terms of the mechanisms for managing change and that transition, it comes back to doing something together so that we can all learn from one another, but tailoring it to your specific system. And I think that's where, you know, I know a couple of the other speakers have mentioned it already. It's identifying how these systems can work in a case specific way. So it's about engaging with other people, but designing trials that can be done on an individual farm basis as well.
And do you find, I mean, how do you measure success is a bit of a silly question, but do you find people are engaging with that? I suppose they are, but is there a level of, you know, some will get more into it than others and get more out of it?
Yeah, I mean, farmers are trialing things every day. You know, you're making decisions, you're looking at the crops, you're using what you're doing to make informed decisions on a daily basis. So trying new things isn't a new thing. It's something that's inherent and fundamental to farming in the UK and has been for a very long time. I think one of the opportunities that we have is defining some common metrics and a common framework, so that then, you know, you could be farming in Shropshire and you're learning something using that framework and those common metrics, but it's being able to benchmark yourself and compare, contrast, and have shared learnings with somebody, say in East Anglia, for example. So if you're running a trial, it's specific to your farm, but if you're measuring, I don't know, biomass at the same growth stage that, say, Brian Barker, you know, a strategic farmer is measuring biomass at that same growth stage, it doesn't necessarily matter if you're doing it on a different soil type or your, you know, potentially your varieties are different as well. You can have shared learnings between a whole network of farmers.
Great, thank you. And Phil, who's going to pay for these new wonderful mixtures of seeds? How much are companies like AWS, Syngenta engaging with this kind of thing?
I think each commercial breeder will have their own doing their own priorities. I believe KWS are starting to take this quite seriously, and are trying to look earlier in the testing about which varieties are better suited to low input and organic situations, rather than just letting the best float to the top in the conventional system and then seeing if they also suit low input situations. So each company will have their own viewpoint on how important that is, and I think it's the job of the rest of us to listen to growers and find out what their priorities are. So again, through NIAB's network, if enough growers say to us, you know, we want some trials under situations that suit our inputs, then we'll go ahead and commission those.
And I know that Warren's Organic Seeds, who are marketing the YQ, for instance, the Wakelins population, are very keen. But also Cope Seeds, both of whom are supporting us on for our events this year. Are you seeing an engagement from the farmers where people are doing their own mixes, their own populations perhaps, or?
Certainly the more curious and technical farmers, and as I guess an agronomy research organisation, we're more exposed to those farmers anyway. But certainly that there seems to be an interest in farmers doing their own tramline trials and this sort of thing. So that there's a genuine curiosity about learning lessons from anywhere, whether they come from the chemical companies, the seed companies, or the organic and low till sectors. So people seem to be keen to learn lessons from anywhere, which I think is great.
So Mark, if I can ask you, where do you get your seed, or where do you look when you're shopping, when you're thinking of the coming season, what you're going to put in? Where do you go to find a range of products?
Well, I mean, this is one of the challenges. We've got 18 million crops in this year, and that's what we can grow is largely dependent on what we can get, not what we want to get. There are enthusiasts that handle very small scale crop collections, maybe on garden and allotment scale. I'm lucky enough to be close to Harper Adams, where Ed Dickin secures the growing of a great number of formerly commercial varieties and ancient varieties as well in his work. So there can be small quantities of seed available, which is what we've been able to find, and then multiply those seeds up, perhaps starting with 10 kilos. And it takes a couple of years to build up to a commercial quantity. We've also started this year a mixture, an 11-way mixture, which sort of got out of hand a bit, but it ended up at 11, but exactly the same philosophy that
a mixture all together.
Yeah, all together. All milling varieties, all milling wheats of the last 40 years, really.
Okay, how's that going?
It looks great. It looks great, and more importantly, it bakes wonderfully. It's just a game in a sense. In the sense, it's very, very easy to do. The simplest thing to do. Working out my royalty payments will be slightly more challenging, I think, than putting the mix together. But we'll worry about that next year.
Great. Okay, thank you. And Ambro, so getting seed for your farmers is going to be interesting because you've got, say, 15, 16 people. Some of them will be growing commonly, won't they? There'll be seed and some will have some stuff that's specific for them. Is that right?
Yes, the key aspect that makes this program, like we call it, a collective experiment, is one, what Emily was saying, trying to get common metrics, and B, try to get what we call an experimental design. So we started, so it's not 3 random varieties that we throw on each farm to say, we try to get this number of varieties as interconnected as possible so that we can have a reasonable comparison across them. Finding the seeds is, of course, we've improved. We were very rigid on the first year when we only had 7 farms. We've been more flexible in the second year, and this year we also have tried to accommodate farmers' preferences more. We have 1 common varieties across all farms, which leaves farmers free also to choose other varieties. And we tend to provide, unless farmers already have the variety on their own, for example, Mark has been saving seeds from YQ and Mariswegian, we tend to provide varieties to the farmer. It is challenging because it depends on what's on the market and what's available. For example, we had a variety called Montana, that many of you know, that has been our key milling variety, modern varieties in the past 2 years, and this year wasn't available. And we actually, this is when you do an experiment deep into reality. You live and you perceive the same difficulties that the producers perceives. At the end of the day, you can talk about how nice it is to have the good variety for your farm and every farm with their own variety. But at the end of the day, you risk to have to grow what's on the shelf of the seed supplier. And it is challenging. We are trying to improve and to move quite in advance as far as live wheat is concerned. but definitely there is a need to rethink the seed system overall to make more varieties available, not only in terms of information, but also in terms of seeds.
Thank you. So can I ask you all then to think about that in terms of, so one thing we haven't really spoken much about, which is disease and disease resistance. And I know that I've had conversations with a lot of people over the years looking at the number of varieties on the recommended list and the frequency with which they change, although the changes are sometimes hard to distinguish other than the name. How can we move that forward? So are we going to see new types of disease coming, do you think, Phil? Is rust going to shift around the country with different times for coming in? Is that something you guys are seeing?
I mean, we run the UK CPVS, so the rust monitoring scheme, and we're constantly getting samples in from growers and agronomists from around the country, both on varieties that we'd expect to see rust on, and also varieties where we're not expecting to see it. So we're constantly monitoring changes in the rust population. Yellow rust clearly isn't going away, and it's like nailing jelly to the wall. It's a really difficult pest disease to control, because the race structure is shifting all the time. So it's one of these cases where you need diversity. So whether you're growing a single variety in a single field, or you're growing populations or whatever, you need to spread your risk. And in the breeding programs, there needs to be this diversity right at the base, because the risk is that if there's a shift in disease population structure, and you're too reliant on one parent in your breeding, then you might lose your whole program and have to start. But if you've got a broad base, then there will always be something that gives you some resistance. I think there's managing the existing diseases, and then there's also the risk of new diseases coming in. So we may be seeing, and it's something we're really trying to monitor, some of the diseases more common on the continent making their way further north with the changing seasons. So that's something we also need to be aware of. And I guess one of the big breeding companies often get a bad press, but one of their strengths is that often they're multinationals. So certainly at my time in Syngenta, we focused very much on the UK, but I used to send my material to France and Germany to see how it performed under much higher fusarium pressure, much higher brown rust pressure, and this sort of thing. And it gives you this little early warning system about what might be coming our way in the future. And it just helps you build up this picture of what's resilient across a whole load of different environments. So I think that's the key, testing things in as many different places as possible to not necessarily give you the cleanest overall, but something it's about resilience. Like Mark was saying, he wants something that's consistent year on year, and that he knows isn't going to be a disaster in any particular year. Even if it's great one year, he doesn't want it if it's a disaster the next. So it's building that resilience into the testing and selection system that's the key.
Thank you. Okay, so Mark, how's disease in terms of what you're cropping at the moment and over the last few years?
Well, I could glibly say we're an organic farm, so we don't have disease issues, couldn't I? What we don't do is take them terribly seriously, partly because I have no way of controlling them, but we do see much lower incidence of disease, obviously, without any artificial nitrogen. So our crops are much thinner, tougher, harder and wirier than they would be with nitrogen, so we obviously don't see the disease pressure, unless a variety has a particular weakness, which is rare. We've only seen a real flare-up, which was rust, last year in a variety which we won't grow again, but that's a variety developed overseas, so not necessarily suited here. It's something that isn't a major consideration to me. diversity is our defence against that, really. And also growing older varieties, which may in their time have had real disease weaknesses when they were widely grown wheats. I don't know whether Phil would agree with that, but a wheat that organic farmers held faith with Clare for many years after it was dropped for mildew weakness, and we didn't see that problem. Obviously the nitrogen was a factor in that, but also with organic being a small sector, very small sector, we can continue to grow varieties once other people stop, because the pathogens, I think, move on with the widely sown wheat, you know, and we can go back. I don't know, did Maris Widgeon have a big weakness? It doesn't show now. Perhaps it did in the 1970s. I don't know when it fell away, but it's certainly something that I believe that if with older wheats they are an advantage simply because they're not widely grown.
Mm-hmm.
Well, Phil, just quickly, because I want to move on to Emily, but just quickly, Maris Widgeon, I'm assuming, was just when, you know, in the 30s, there was a move towards a more intensive bread making process. So was that more, that's my feeling as to why Maris Widgeon was taken back.
I think yeah, as sort of intensification post-war really started to bring in more and more fertilizer use. And yes, you're right. I mean, Chorleywood came in the early 60s. Chorleywood, yeah. Highly mechanized bread process, and that really did for some of these varieties where it was the gluten strength that was key, the key aspect of the proteins. So it's a combination of the two. It's the industrialization of the inputs and the industrialization of the bread making, I think, combined.
So
it wasn't that it didn't perform particularly. I mean, its performance didn't drop off, but those more industrial processes favoured different types of variety. So Widgeon stood still and other things overtook it. It wasn't that Widgeon got worse.
Interesting. So whilst I would love to advocate for the removal of the Chorleywood bread making process, this isn't that webinar, but anybody who wants to know my feelings on that only needs to ask. Emily, can I ask you, this webinar, one of the sort of themes behind it is farmers looking to reduce inputs. What seeds are they going to grow and what tillage practices will they use? Are you seeing farmers wanting to reduce inputs?
Yeah, absolutely. I think from a resistance management point of view, it's kind of chicken and egg, isn't it? Farmers are being forced to reduce inputs because we don't have access to them, because they're not as what's the word I'm thinking of, as effective as they used to be. So, you know, there's, in terms of the cost benefit of treating certain varieties, it's not in the best interests of the farmers to treat them. So yes, there is a move to reduce inputs, both from that resistance management, from the cost effectiveness point of view, and in terms of, it's reducing inputs, but it's targeting them, I think, as well. So it's making sure that the crop is still profitable and viable, making sure that farmers target those inputs in the most appropriate way, whilst also looking at the bigger picture. So, you know, the environmental impact of it, the impact on natural enemies, things like that, in terms of pest management. So yeah, we've got lots of work looking at reducing inputs, and it's certainly something that farmers are moving towards. And I think as well, it's quite interesting learning from farmers who are on different points in this journey. So, you know, obviously Mark, you know, we can look to him and see how he's doing it, and learning from one another I think is a really important point to make. Something actually that I wanted to ask, if you don't mind, Stephen, think about working together and learning from one another. Something that so Phil mentioned it when you did your introduction slides, and Mark mentioned it just now, in terms of the reason that Maris Widgeon worked was because it wasn't widely grown. And Phil, you mentioned about having like a local, I think, did you say like a local group of farmers in terms of local bread making or something that could potentially, in terms of variety selection, you know, in a local region. And how do we move towards that kind of landscape scale crop planning? Because if we want these varieties to work, it needs to be done in quite a managed way. Does that make sense, what I'm kind of getting at? We can't all suddenly go out and start looking at lowering our inputs by growing these varieties, because there is a risk that the varieties won't be able to stand up. I don't know, Mark, if you've got any ideas.
I don't know, and it's not. I don't know in the sense that I'm not involved with the sort of the recommended list or anything, or how that works in any way. But obviously the way it appears to work to me as a grower is that a new variety takes the top slot, or one of the top slots gets on the recommended list, which is a very small number of varieties. So a very large area takes the market share for that variety can be huge very quickly, and that seems to be connected with the lifespan of varieties. I guess my suggestion would be to look much lower down. Organic farmers are often asked how they choose their varieties, and the recommended list isn't necessarily a very good place at all for us to look, because those varieties are tested under high inputs naturally. So I totally understand why breeders have to drop varieties and they have to have a certain amount of sales in order to maintain them. But that's the frustration. It would be great if there were a much wider number of varieties available. Or perhaps there are enough. Perhaps it's just that farmers tend to be conservative and always pick from the top 5. I don't know what the answer is, I'm afraid, but that's the problem as I see it.
Phil?
I mean, I've heard criticism from farmers, and I'm sure you have as well, Emily, that there are too many varieties on the recommended list. There's too much choice, and how are you supposed to make your mind up? So I guess you'll never please everyone. And it's you make a very good point, Mark. It's a significant financial risk for, at that stage, it's not so much the breeder as the seed trade to support a variety if it's falling in acreage. Everyone wants to have the blockbuster because then it's fewer crops to manage and crop inspect and so on, and it just simplifies the whole system. But we need, something needs to change. It's not sustainable in the long term, and we need a talking shop about it. We need to put our heads together and work out the best way to do it. There may be almost different tiers, so you may have one tier for the current status quo for the leading varieties, and then there may be another way of perhaps different companies taking on the risk of varieties that are at a much smaller acreage, but one that's not expected to change very much over time. There's probably a role for smaller companies in there.
Well, at that point, I will give a shout out to Smales, who are doing some very good work in the north of England. Ambro, you wanted to come in, and then I think we'll round up because it's 10:20. What did you want to say?
2 things mainly. Three. The first one is very small. We're talking mostly of wheat because wheat is one of the most complex genomes, and there is so much diversity into it. But this is not the only crop. It's one of the most important. There is a high demand. So there are maybe other crops, I'm thinking especially on the pulses, where there may not be so much genetic variation to dig into to find what we need. Second, in wheat, varieties are one aspect. We started live wheat as a variety trials, having in mind that varieties were the gauge to understand and measure what the cropping systems were actually doing, because it's all it works all together. And you need to look at varieties with all the other aspects, thinking of the sowing schemes. We didn't even know that, for example, until we went through the farms and seeing how things were different. Third, if Maris Wigeon and YQ works very well at Mark Lees, it's not, we can't say automatically that they work well anywhere else. So what we're trying to do is also see what works well where, and of course we need more evidence. But doing that, of course, this is limited by the number and the type of business model that breeding has. And I might say something that I'm saying, that once every country in Europe had a Plant Breeding Institute, and there was the PBI in the UK, where Martin Wolf used to work and where Maris Wigeon was constituted and registered. And there were more varieties, and perhaps there was more attention to the regions and to the type of growing systems. I remember same story also from Italy. Perhaps there needs to be a bit of coming back to a bit of public engagement into pre-breeding and breeding and variety constitution, because it cannot only be on return on investment. It won't lead to landscape planning and diversity if it's only based on the acreage that one variety will cover, which is good. And I'm not saying you need to change everything overnight, but we need a more inclusive system.
Well, okay, so just before we sum up, because we've had a question from our old colleague Nick Frangeli, he's asking, is the weight cleanse paying for itself? Is there money going back into breeding research off the back of selling the YQ? I think the answer is no.
Of course, no. Although it may increase, but
yeah, and I think this is one of the problems.
It wasn't done to make money out of it. So perhaps putting into the market with a classic royalty scheme wasn't, I mean, the Live Seed project is a bigger European project and is looking at the different business models. And I'm sure something interesting will come out from there. Cooperative models, supply chain support, there are many alternatives.
Yeah. Yeah, well, and I think it was touched on earlier, and John Borsey asked a question about it, about localized systems. Could you have a localized breeding program? And I know that, for instance, in the Southwest, there's a sort of mini grain lab going on, and it's working really well. That Fred Price at Gothamy and is working with bakers to do that, and is starting to cross plants himself. But I think in terms of volume, we need to see changes also in the processing and retail end, because the demand, as we've discussed, is for the jewellery making process at the moment. That is altering, as somebody said in an article talking about farming and payments. It's a big ship to turn around. So maybe we could have more discussion. We welcome people feeding back about this. Before we close, can I ask you all to reflect? When I started writing this, it was before the pandemic, and we had 3 major crises ahead of us: Brexit, climate, and the 6th mass extinction, the erosion of biological diversity. Now we have a pandemic. So, and warnings of further such pandemics. How do you see things going in the future? Are we best maybe to just open our doors to biotech from America so the big corporate companies can come and sell things to us? Do you think that's the answer? Or do you see some halfway house where Britain can work better with its neighbours, and farmers perhaps would be more collegiate? Emily, are farmers cooperative? Are they listening to others?
Yeah, I mean, from what I see, absolutely.
I mean, it's a trick question, obviously, because I think they are.
I'm always amazed. Like, I mean, last week, some of you will know we had, a week of Strategic Farm Week webinars, and I don't think, if I think how many extracurricular, as such, to use that phrase, webinars do I dial into in my own time, from a work perspective, it's none. But actually, this is what farmers are doing on a daily basis. We've got people dialed in now. So in terms of collaborating and looking for new information and sharing knowledge, they do it every day, so you can't fault that. I think it's interesting you were saying about the different challenges and the opportunities, and actually I made some notes when we were going through and just reflecting back on those polls that we did. And yes, we've got obviously a very immediate pandemic at the moment, and you've mentioned like Brexit and different technologies, but when we did that poll earlier, the biggest challenge that the people on the webinar rated was the weather. So there's all these other external things that are going on, but fundamentally the weather is posing the biggest challenge. And I don't know whether that's just because it's this year and it has been a particularly challenging and difficult season for many of our farmers, but I think that's quite an interesting point that I'll end on, because there's all these other things, but the weather is still there as a major challenge.
Yeah, the flood and now the drought.
Yeah.
Reflections. Are you seeing? Is the work at NIAB, reaching out more? I know Nick Bradley, and I know that the work that he's doing is reaching out more for different germplasm and working with different ways of cultivation. Is that the way forward?
I think so. I mean, we've got a lot of research looking at farming systems, looking at rotations, and looking at long-term work. And securing the funding for long-term work is a recurrent problem. And Ambo, your point about more public investment in things like an underpinning plant breeding, so that the private sector isn't having to do all the heavy lifting, and we can have this thread of things going through. This is where we'd be looking for help from DEFRA, from the levy boards and so on, for something underpinning all aspects. So not just breeding, but a lot of the agronomy work as well. We won't know the answers to some of these things just by doing 1 year's trials. We need a much bigger long-term view of these things.
So Ambro, just quickly, because I want to give the last word to our farmer, Mark, and also I want to tell people about a handout that comes with this webinar, which is the OF&G Organic Arable Guide. So Ambro, from what you've seen, are the varieties you're using successful?
Didn't catch the question.
So in Phil and Emily have highlighted the need for funding, particularly for breeding, and we're looking at some of those older varieties, the mixtures, the different techniques, are these proving resilient?
Resilience is a tricky question. We need a little bit more time to see, but some farmers say yes, some farmers say no. What I just wanted to say is about the transition. So of course, we may all know what a better world would look like. It's hard to say what the first step. Now, for instance, what we are doing with live wheat, which is done in cooperation with the farmers, of course, with the AHDB and with support from DEFRA, is saying the first step is perhaps, as far as wheat is concerned, to identify a group of varieties that may perform well into organic systems, which is something that we now don't have. This can enable the organic wheat production to grow a little bit, and this will make room for more innovation to come in. And sometimes to make things work and make a change, you need to start from something that may be not ideal to make room for something that is more ideal. So always look at the transition, always look at what the first step is and what the second step might be. Some of these varieties are resilient. If we firm up that they are resilient, we're going to recommend to the seed growers to grow those varieties as organic, for example, so that there will be more organic seed available for organic farmers, and low inputs non-organic farmers will have their recommendation on what to grow, whether they want to reduce input in one way or another. Have I replied to the question?
Yes, and I think the answer is we need to share more with each other more. So Mark, on that, what's your takeaway from what you've done? You've been, what, 2 or 3 crop rotations as an organic farmer. You found the system perhaps was a bit like riding a bucking bronco at first, but has it settled down?
In a way it has. We're 20 years organic, so we've been right round 4 times now. Our rotation is still basically the same, so that proves to me that we are okay, sustainable, if I dare say it, in that sense. But then again, we're changing all the time. I think this year we have more trials than ever before. The last 3 years, certainly, there's trials in everything. So we are, along with an awful lot of what I would think is progressive agriculture across all camps, understanding more about soil biology than ever before, and resilience and everything else is becoming the priority now. That applies to the weather suggestion as much as anything else. That's the one that's pressing. The weather issue is the one that everybody's thinking about at the moment. But of course, resilience is the key, and I think we are all agreed that diversity is the key to that. So yeah, lots and lots to learn still. Just a beginner.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you. Well, I'd like to thank you all. Just before I finish, I'll thank you all and then show the handout to people. So thank you, Emily, Phil, Mark and Ambro. It's been a very interesting, it's slightly disturbing conversation. Resilience is key, so is diversity, but both of which are not won overnight. So this is the technical leaflet. The TL128, it's a great title. But in this, we talk about what happens when you are farming as an organic farmer. And there is John Pawsey talking about his costs. And as you can see from this slide, which is covered in the guide, it's that rotation started to settle down as he went to a 5-year organic rotation with no livestock, and then a 6-year organic rotation with livestock. And the gross margin is the big figure at the bottom. So rather than productivity, we're looking at profitability, although I'm sure John would agree, I know he's out there somewhere, that the productivity can also be measured in resilience with an integrated ecosystem. So on that note, I think we'll say goodbye. That's one of John's sheep. The next in the line of NOC webinars will be actually John Pawsey hosting for the NFU Organic Group a farm walk on the 23rd of June. Then we will be with the AHDB again on the 7th of July with Charlotte Smith leading a conversation with John Pawsey and Clive Bailey. And then later in July, we've got Roger Kerr, Sue Pritchard from the Food Farming and Countryside Commission in conversation with Charlotte and Dr. Bruce Pearce and Vicky Hurd. I'd like to thank everybody who's registered, especially our contributors, and I hope this was of some use. Anybody who wants to get hold of us, we're at OF&G Organic, and we'll see you soon.